listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Janet Cristofaro, and produced by Dougie Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Hey listeners, do you know what's the most challenging part of doing this show? I used to think it was the steep learning curve that came with all the tech elements of recording and editing, but 9 years in, the hardest part is writing these episode introductions. How do I reduce a nuanced, complex, rich conversation down to a few intriguing sentences? I'm a social worker, not a copywriter, so succinct and punchy aren't really my strongest skills. All that to say, some intros are harder than others, for many reasons. This time, it's because Lisa Keefauver lives many lives. She's a writer, a speaker, a fellow social worker, a widow, a cancer survivor, a grief activist, and an astute observer of patterns, practices, and bigger systems. All of those roles come together for this conversation, where Lisa and I talk about her husband Eric, who died of a brain tumor in 2011, and how the experience of being a widow and a mental health professional and the mom of a daughter grieving for a father highlighted how systems, communities, information, and even ourselves are operating from a place of grief illiteracy. This recognition spurred Lisa into the role of grief activist, committed to changing how people who are grieving are treated, in an effort, as she puts it, to reduce the unnecessary suffering that comes with trying to grieve our grief with people, places, and entire systems who don't get it. As a grief activist, Lisa started the acclaimed podcast, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, and has recently published a book, also titled Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, an uncensored guide to navigating loss. Lisa is warm, funny, candid, and as I'm sure is no surprise, uses some salty language. So if that's not your thing, you might want to skip this one. Okay, enough with the intro. Let's get to the conversation. Lisa, thank you so much for coming on Grief Out Loud. It's always exciting and a little intimidating to have another grief podcast host on the show.
Thank you so much for having me. And I feel a little intimidated as well, but mostly excited. As I was saying to you off the air, I've been a longtime listener of Grief Out Loud. I've even included a few episodes in my curriculum when I've taught the grief and loss course. So it's cool to be now a part of the Grief Out Loud canon.
Yeah, well, one day maybe you'll have your own episode in your own class curriculum, and that will be very, very meta.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, you've got a long-running podcast, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, and now you've got a book coming out, same title, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. And listeners, that book is coming out in June. I don't know if you're listening to this pre or post the book being out, but it is available soon or now, and I will put links of where you can find it. So, Lisa, as you know from Grief Out Loud, I really love to just start with people kind of talking about what's their personal experience with grief and loss, what's their connection to the work that they're doing. And you've told your story about your husband, Eric's death, many, many times in public ways and in private ways. And, you know, how do you want to tell the story today?
I love that question. And I always love an opportunity to bring Eric into the room wherever I can, as we're approaching, it'll be 13 years this summer, since he passed. I think I want to tell a little bit of the story of Eric in the ways in which I now am able to be connected to the gift that his love was in my life and in this phase of my grief. Of course, I miss him dearly still from day to day. He was an unexpected love of my life in my late 20s, having not had a good history with romance and having survived some violence in my teens. I really hadn't expected to have that love and that life. And we had magical almost 12 years together. The 11th that last year turned really sour when he went undiagnosed from a massive brain tumor and became a completely different person. To become a widow at 40, no surprise to anyone, was just one of the biggest shocks of my life, especially as I was a social worker and clinical director and sort of thought I would or should know how to do this well, using air quotes and major sarcasm here. And so I really stumbled my way through my work and my life and towards my work about becoming a grief activist, which we can talk about. But one of the things I've been reflecting on this past year is a real shift in my grief, in that I'm deeply connected to my gratitude for the ways in which he taught me to love and what it meant to love and be loved, which is not something that I honestly ever expected to experience in that way in my life. And Eric did that by being a deeply curious person and a kind person. And he would always like sort of look you right in the eyes and smile and be interested. He was the person who was made everybody feel like the center of attention in a room. And so as I move into this, yeah, I mean, it's now sort of, I've been without him now longer than I was with him, which is a real landmark place for, I know, for so many folks grieving. I'm really present to the gift of his life and his love. That doesn't mean, you listeners, you might know if you've followed my work, both and is sort of my mantra everywhere, and is tattooed on my body. The both and of that is the truth that also, as I celebrate this clear scan for my breast cancer, which I've recently received, and I'm about to launch this book into the world, there's also deep grief that I can't turn to him and say, look, baby, I'm free of cancer, which he didn't get to survive. Or I wrote a book. Can you believe I wrote a book? So that's how I want to talk about Eric, really, which is about the gift of his love and his life. And though his death was tragic and problematic, and there was systemic failures in the medical system that led to his death, that kept me in a lot of deep grief and resentment for a long time. In this season of my grief, I just feel a lot of gratitude for the lessons of loving and being loved.
Well, I just want to take a minute to appreciate the way you articulate the change in grief, right? Which is such a nice shift from the resolution of grief, or the like, I'm beyond grief, or I've gone past it, or whatever it is. It's like just sitting in that place of knowing grief is going to change over time. And who knows what it's going to show up with today or the season or this year. But to recognize that there's progression,
Yes.
but not in the way that we think about progression of moving towards it not being there anymore. And you mentioned, like, when Eric died, you were working in the field, the mental health field, clinical director, and thought, like, I should be able to do this good. And when I hear that, I always think, at least for me, like, well, by good, we mean like not feel it.
Exactly. Good means getting back into this capitalist system and being a part of the, community and the world, and to not show emotion, for sure, for sure. I always say, I wish you could think your way through grief, but you just can't. And believe me, I've tried. I did the homework for you all. I tried. You cannot. I wish you could, but you can't.
And I also want to just pause and acknowledge, like, the celebration place that you're in of getting a clear scan for your breast cancer, publishing your book. When someone has a big tragedy, a husband dies, you're 40, sometimes there can be this piece of like, okay, well, the hardest thing happened, so no more bad things are coming, right? And it doesn't work that way. And I just wondered if you wanted to share a bit about what it was like to be a person who is grieving the death of your husband many years later, and to receive a diagnosis of cancer yourself.
Yeah, it was a real cluster F asterisks there. Trying to mind my P's and Q's here. I think that is such an important thing that you just brought up. I just want to name, before I say sort of my experiences, again, part of our sort of happily ever after culture is really about like us coming to grips with like bad things do happen to good people, that phrase, and also that we are only given a certain allotment. And, surviving a rape when I was 15, I think I thought, okay, well, surely that's it. And I was actually the victim of many crimes while I was in college. I go through the list, and then surviving the death of my husband. And I wasn't sure there for a while if I was going to survive. Again, I think I fell under that same false, like, well, surely that's going to be it. And then a few years later, I was with my friend Joe when he died. And so the experience of being diagnosed with cancer was especially challenging and problematic, not just because, like, seriously, universe, again, but as I alluded to, my husband was misdiagnosed for over a year with his symptoms and not run tests, and turned out to have a grapefruit-sized brain tumor and died in my arms 2.5 weeks after his diagnosis. For a year, I was going to doctors saying, I've got this lump on my breast that I could feel on the external part of my breast. And I was given an ultrasound, told it was nothing. I was given a mammogram, told it was nothing. And I continued to advocate for myself just as I had for my husband, and felt quite gaslit, to be honest. So here I was going through a system that had wholly and tragically failed me in the past and failed my husband. And then finally, after more than a year of going to, I think I saw maybe 5 doctors, someone finally did a biopsy, and it turned out it had been triple positive breast cancer all along. This was 10 days before my manuscript was due to my publisher, and about a month before I was to take the TEDx stage, both of which were like dreams come true. So I think, to answer your question, receiving this diagnosis of cancer after this misdiagnosis and having it be such a reflection of the experience that I went through with Eric really took me to my knees in a way that I'm not sure that I still have the words more than a year and a half later to articulate. I felt a kind of rage and a frustration that I'm not sure that I felt in my life. And also, I think the complication, which maybe your listeners can relate to, is I now had to put my life in the hands of a system that had so utterly failed us so many times before. And so that's where I say that's sort of the cluster, you can beep it out, the clusterfuckery of having to navigate cancer this last year, is having to be in that hypervigilant state all the time and figuring out when I can trust and being able to turn over my care, to people who had historically betrayed me, really, in a way. And so it's been a real act of, I don't even know the words, grace, self-care, trust, work to navigate this system of care, not to mention the brutality of chemotherapy and radiation and surgery and infusions and medication and the whole 9 yards. And to do it alone, I think that's something we're not talking about enough. So, or I just see that in the scheme of things, is it's one thing to navigate cancer and to navigate cancer in a system that has failed your family in the past, or any illness, I would say, if you're listening. But then to do it, I had 2 girlfriends who were navigating breast cancer at the exact same time as me, believe it or not. And several guests on my show had just recently. But all of them were, well, my husband's going to the store to pick up the meds, and my husband's doing this, and husband's doing that. And there I was alone in my house. Well, my rescue dog, Miss Frankie, would tell you that I was not alone, but she was not so useful at helping me with things. Yeah.
She hadn't figured out the grocery store run.
She hadn't figured out the grocery store run, and I was super grateful. I had friends fly in from across the country to accompany me to various chemotherapy appointments, and new friends here in my new hometown of San Diego take me. So it's not that I was alone, but that's not the same as having your life partner navigate this most scary experience with you.
Yeah, I'm just imagining, or not, I'm not imagining, I'm just picturing, you in this really vulnerable place, right? Of being, not even to get to the diagnosis was a vulnerable place, to really have to advocate for yourself. And to then be in this vulnerable place where you want to turn to people in positions of knowledge to say, please help, and I'm handing over the care of myself to you. But to have this experience with your husband, Eric, to say, that didn't go so well. So how can I do that wholeheartedly in this moment when I really need this help as well? And it reminds me of the part in your book where you're talking about all the complications that can come with grief. And there was a part in there where you wrote about, like, when we come into each new grief experience, we bring our whole history with us.
Yeah.
And I think about, like, not only do we bring our own personal history, we bring our family's history,
yes,
our culture's history. All that comes into the room with us and plays a role in how we interact or receive information or how we are treated. So just imagining, I don't know, it's a lot of words to say, like, ay.
Yeah. Well, and even just to add, like, so just a few weeks ago, I had, I'm coming to the end of a year of immunotherapy infusions on top of, as I said, the surgery, the 12 weeks of chemo, the 30 days of radiation, and the pills I'll be on for 5 years. And I had my 3D mammogram scan, and I couldn't even accept the results that said clear and benign because I was like, did you even run the right test? Should it have been an MRI? Can I really trust in my body the news that I'm all clear? I mean, I'm just being totally transparent. I'm still feel like there's 1% of me that is having a hard time. And that brings so much grief and resentment that I can't turn over, my trust and care into a system so that I can be fully immersed in this celebratory place. Because of, as you said, I'm bringing all of this historical miscare basically into this place. And I think we do that a lot in our grief, in our trauma. And I'm working, there's the things we can't control, which are the systems, the way in which the systems operate. And so I have been working to really work on my own hypervigilance, on my own somatic care, on my own trauma, so that I can gift myself the gift of ease and peace and acceptance, because that is not going to be coming from the systems.
So just a few more things for you to do on your to-do list.
Just a few things on my to-do list. Yes. And I'm so grateful for all of that. I'm grateful for the resources, and I'm grateful for the insight. And I also recognize I wouldn't have even known about some of those resources or ways of being and caring for myself if I wasn't in the field, if I hadn't spent the last 5 years interviewing guests from all these walks of life, and not everybody has access, which is why I love what you do on the show, which is why I love the work that I do on my show, and is just helping us all think about the different tools and resources and skills, which I did try to put so many of in the book to help us navigate the more expansive way in which we're grieving beyond death losses. I think of all the grief experiences here, but the skills and practices that help us combat grief, which is a normal response to loss on an emotional, cognitive, physical, relational, and spiritual level. It's not just feeling sad, right? Which is, I think, the story that we have in our culture. And so everything that I talk about in the book is something I've practiced or learned from, someone that I've interviewed or researched. And that sort of puts me in a prime position, I think. I get to walk the walk here.
Given what you went through, Lisa, with Eric and his misdiagnosis and then the diagnosis and all the ways that the medical world kind of fell apart and not supporting the two of you. After Eric died, it seems like there's also a bit of like a formative experience in your grief of being this Lisa without her husband, and then trying to go back to work and engage with the world. And really, it seemed like it really stood out to you how much our world isn't set up to support people who are grieving. And that seemed to really be a pivotal moment in your work. And so I just wondered if you could share a little bit more about what did you learn about how grief goes unsupported?
Okay, I so appreciate this question. I think I alluded to it a little bit in the book, and I know I definitely talked about it from the TED stage. I was required, I was a social worker, work for social workers, and was required to return to work 2 weeks after my husband died, if you can imagine. And there I showed up. I was the clinical supervisor for students. I was working as a therapist directly with folks working in crisis intervention. And it started to dawn on me that even these skilled clinicians around me, right, didn't bring up the subject, didn't know what to say, was awkward. I didn't know what to say. There was such obvious grief illiteracy surrounding me. And then every time I spoke with a client who was, presenting with something like depression or anxiety, or I'm recognizing all the ways in which, as a field that is purportedly, right, should be an expert in this field and beyond, was so grief illiterate, and that grief illiteracy was causing harm because we were pathologizing the very normative responses, physiological, cognitive, emotional responses to loss beyond death loss. I worked with people in foster care and adoption, with refugees. I think of chronic illness. I think about, it started to just like sparks started flying in my eyes. Like, I am suffering unnecessarily because the world around me doesn't have a full expanded picture. And we have I didn't have the language then, I have the language now, but had a very narrow, singular, misleading story of grief. And that was causing so much unnecessary suffering to me and to my daughter, but also to my clients and the world around us. And that really took some time for me to really metabolize. And this, one of the ways in which I suffered unnecessarily was the ways I did and didn't show up appropriately for my daughter, who had a very different grieving style, the ways I did and didn't show up for myself in terms of my physical well-being and my cognitive functioning, and the relationship and understanding the secondary losses and the relationships in my life. And also the ways in which I wasn't always recognizing the grief that was happening in my clients' lives. So that spark was sort of a slow burn, but always leading me towards that next thing. That led me to founding a nonprofit to help cancer patients, ironically, a few years later when I moved to Texas, and so on and so forth. But it was my own early experience. I mean, I'm sort of embarrassed to say I had to go through my own real profound loss to really wake up to the problematic and dangerous collective grief illiteracy that we are part of our system and our culture, and then turn that towards really that's the whole mission of my work in everything I do, teaching at the universities and on stages and the book and the podcast, and everything that I do is really expanding the narratives of grief, taking my narrative therapy training and really expanding it so that we reduce any unnecessary suffering. Grief is hard. I don't believe we need to suffer. I think the suffering that we do comes from all the ways in which we have so wholly misunderstood and forgotten actually our innate and natural capacity to grieve. It Grief, actually, most of us know what to do and how to do it. It completely flies in the contradiction of the way that our culture and society is set up. And so part of what I'm trying to do is, instead of people turning inward and shooting all over themselves, as I often say, about why am I not functioning well and how come I'm not doing as well as that person, or why am I crying, or why am I having aches and pains, or why am I feeling crazy, which so many grievers say, I'm trying to shine the light on, actually, here's all the reasons why you're okay. As Megan Devine says, it's okay that you're not okay.
Speaking of shoulds, another favorite chapter of mine in your book, because you list so many of them. When you think back to kind of the early days of your grief after Eric died, are there one or two shoulds that were very strong for you that did create a lot of that additional suffering?
Boy, how do I narrow it down to one or two? I feel like my head was just a litany. My inner critic is very loud. I call her Lucille, like after Lucille Booth, the TV character. But I think some of the shoulds were around, I should be able to care for my daughter or be a better support for my daughter and know how to care for her. She was just 7 when my husband died, and we adopted her. So she already came from a history and a lineage really of grief and loss. Her grieving style, because of her attachment and other things, was so very different than mine. I was an external expressive processor. That was my grief style. She was more of a rational internalizing processor. And so I had a lot of shoulds about what I should and shouldn't do, talking to her, creating ritual, not creating ritual. Was I helping her grieve right? Was I harming her? Is she going to be okay? Am I making it worse? So those shoulds really, including, by the way, I made the decision to have her come say goodbye to him when we had to take him off life support. So the should started actually before he died. Should I do that? Shouldn't I have done that? Was it the right thing or the wrong thing? So I think that's really one of the biggest. And then I think back to the should of, like, I should know how to snap out of it, like back to where we were talking about earlier, just to how to not get so emotional and be so messy in places. Like, I remember being at a party with a new friend. Actually, that's where the title Grief is a Sneaky Bitch came from. It was maybe a year after Eric died, and I was at a party with a new friend who had experienced loss, and I trusted her quite well. And I was actually laughing for one of the first times ever, since his illness and him dying. And I reached into my purse and I found a printed up picture of him, which I I don't print out pictures, so I still to this day don't know how it got in there. And in the middle of this party full of people I did not know, started bawling. I mean, like ugly cry, bawling. And then I went over to her, she pulled me aside and she said, "What's wrong?" And I just looked at this picture and I said, "Grief is such a sneaky bitch." That's where the title came from. But that was an example of one of those days I spent the rest the following 2 days. What's wrong with me? Why couldn't I hold it together? I was having a happy time. I should be able to not be messy in front of people. I have that real judgment that I think I had internalized, like, it's been a year. Stop being messy. Get over it. You should be having fun. Yeah. So those are two of the many, many, I would say, shoulds. And really the work that I do with so much of the work I do with people particularly in the individual work that I do with folks is I feel my best gift to people is helping hold a mirror up to the ways in which they're shoulding all over themselves and really helping them examine, just as I have done and continue to do to this day, where those beliefs are coming from. Are those beliefs useful and of service? And if not, are they getting in the way? And what can I replace those beliefs with? Because so often it's the stories that we tell ourselves that are stories that are embedded with grief beliefs that we've inherited, that we aren't even aware of, that cause us so much unnecessary harm. And those are what turn out to be the shoulds and the shouldn'ts that rule our lives in ways that cause unnecessary suffering.
So much of your work is really rooted in helping people better understand, like, what is this mess that we call grief? Like, what is happening? And one of the questions that comes up a lot in the groups that I run is around, like, why does grief mess with our sense of time so much? And I wondered if you had any takes on that, where people will say it feels like it's been a second and it feels like it's been 100 years all at the exact same time. How is that possible?
Yeah. It's grief time is its own parallel universe. I agree. I have so many clients who said it feels like things are happening in slow motion and fast forward all at the same time. Mm-hmm. Or it might be from 1 minute to the next, things feel frozen and, like you're moving through mud. And then the next, it's just like you hit the fast forward button. And also time is complicated because we have so much cognitive, as Mary Frances O'Connor and others helping us understand the real cognitive impact on our grief brain. So we might just be totally checked out, not to mention if we have trauma, we might be dissociating and then coming to, and where did the last month go? Where did the last year go? And so I think those are all the reasons in which why time is so complicated. And I definitely experienced that. I think it was like a month or two after Eric died. I just sort of thought, like, I know I showed up at work. I know I drove my daughter to school. I know I must have eaten and fed her and brushed my teeth, and I probably slept. And ironically, I ended up having to get an emergency root canal a few days after Eric died because, your body, that's the other thing. There's a physiological impact of grief. But I do remember sort of being like, where did the time go? Shock has a real impact on our ability to be connected with the reality of time. I think the other reason time can be so unique in grief is that maybe early on we're so desperate we're so desperate both to cling to the moment when that person, if it was a death loss that we're grieving, was still alive, but also we just want to not feel this pain anymore. And so as we get further away, we're on the one hand grateful that the acute pain of early grief is lessened. And yet time feels very cruel there because it's that much more time that we've lived and walked in the world without our person. And that's, I think, also what makes grief really complicated, because we are trying to carry those memories from the past and hold on to them because sometimes we're the only memory keeper to those experiences. And that's where I think we kind of dance between the past and the present, and sometimes even fear a future without them. And so time becomes really messy and complicated. Yeah.
And prickly in a way that maybe it didn't feel prior to having someone die. Like you mentioned, as I start to feel less raw in my grief, what does that say about how much time has passed? And then there's places where people are like, I kind of want to go back and feel that rawness again. And we'll like purposely poke at it to
Yes.
feel that again as a way to feel reconnected, either to that time and space or to that person. And so that's always interesting to watch people kind of, like you said, bounce back and forth in that place.
Which is totally normative. And I think, one other thing that comes up for me when I think about time and grief that makes it more challenging, I really appreciate that language of like going back to the memories and sort of poking it, because to feel so much of what we experience is that we feel that our love for that person and our honoring of that person is equated with the pain we feel of their loss, right? And that's kind of the story we tell ourselves in that early poking. I think the other complicating factor I would add about time and why it feels prickly and problematic is back to this sort of notion about this cultural myth of moving on, which is, maybe if you're lucky in the early weeks or months, you have people showing up and checking in and maybe asking you to tell stories or sharing stories of your person. But as we hit those milestones of a year or more, people stop showing up and start, whether it's explicitly or more often implicitly, showing us that they're ready to move on and they're not interested in talking about it. And so in a way, we experience those secondary losses starting in, year 2 and year 3, because people are not helping us carry our person with us and are maybe not showing up in our ways because they can't deal with our grief and our sorrow. And that begets losses, which then triggers our desire to sort of connect back to that time when our person was still here.
The other term that was new to me that you brought into your book was this idea of the grief thief.
Yeah.
These thieves of grief. And I was like, ooh, that's cool. I want to hear more about that. So can you tell us about like what's a grief thief and how do they show up?
I know. I loved that. Grief thief is a term. I don't, you listeners, or if you read the book, hopefully you'll see this. I've just always loved metaphor and terms when it's helped me digest complicated information that's out there. And I don't even remember when I thought of grief thief. It was, I don't know, maybe even a decade ago, but I started to recognize the way that grief thieves are, by the way, other people. Grief thieves are systems, but also, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, sometimes we're the grief thief, both in our own grief and in other people's grief. So grief thieves are really either the systems or the people or the actions that deny or interrupt our right to experience our grief the way that we are meant to experience it, which looks different on any given day. So I think about ways in which, our lack of bereavement policies, for example, in our systems are grief thieves because they deny our right to take the time off at all, or maybe they deny our right to take time off if it's a miscarriage or an uncle or if it's a pet loss, right? So there's like systemic ways in which we are thieved, but there's also ways in which culturally, which trickles down to the people in our life. I think I wish I would have flagged it in the book, was like people run the gratitude con, right? So again, culturally, we have this myth that you can either be grieving or grateful versus both, and so people will say well, how it shows up, you might know you're being conned when somebody starts a sentence with you, at least, which listeners, just don't ever start a sentence with at least, right? At least they're not suffering anymore. At least you had X number of years with your person, at least, right? So that's one way in which we are grief thieved, is through these expressions and the myths in which we have around that. But sometimes we grief thief ourselves. And one of the biggest tools of the grief thief is back to what we were just talking about, which is the should. So maybe we, want to memorialize our person on their birthday or on the anniversary, but people have told us I need to stop talking about our person. And so I should all over myself for wanting to host another memorial or a ritual service, etc., or for crying at a party when you don't know people, right? So grief thieves are just abound everywhere in the language, in the greeting card culture that we have, in the systems and policies that deny the fact that grief doesn't happen in the first 3 days after someone dies, and that actually it's going to get messy and worse, month 3 or when the next anniversary or the birthday comes. But it also happens in the ways we do and don't show up or hold space or bear witness for the messiness of other people's grief. So I encourage people often to be on the lookout for the grief thief, especially the one in the mirror, because that's the one we have the most control over. Yeah.
I'm picturing the grief thief showing up with like a tool belt and many tools. And one of them is like a ring of keys, and each key is labeled should.
Yes.
And there's
I
like, you know,
love
like
that. Okay, we need to create a little t-shirt or a logo or something like that. It is, and it's really, as grief thieves are, they're very sneaky. Some are, I say in the book, some are daylight bank robber grief thieves, and some are pickpockets. And so part of what I always invite folks to do, and by the way, everything, as I said, that I talk about in the book on my show, I do myself. So I am practicing what I preach, is to start to become on the lookout, sort of to be a detective. I say be a should detective, but in a way you're being a detective around those grief thieves, because the thieving that happens is part of that unnecessary suffering. And it keeps us from checking in with what I really believe is that we have an inner knowing, like really deep down, we have an inner knowing about how we need and want to express and metabolize our grief or perform our mourning, if we think about mourning being grief gone public. And it's those thieves and the shoulds that interfere with that, our ability to trust our own internal instinct to be with our grief. And that includes, again, the systems that don't allow us to do that or disenfranchise our grief altogether by not even naming or recognizing our grief. But grief thieves are everywhere. And so our work is to sort of be not hypervigilant in the like they're dangerous, but just to be on the lookout so that they are not taking an advantage of you and denying you your right to grieve. And again, sometimes you're your own worst grief thief. So be on the lookout for yourself in the mirror.
Listen for those jangling keys.
Exactly.
You know, in this moment, as you're talking, you know, hearing so much about the things that stand in the way of maybe us being able to access our natural expression of grief, whether that's a system block or a personal block or a learned block. I also think like there's not a lot of modeling for how to do it, right? So if you actually circumnavigate all those blocks and you're like, okay, now I'm in the wide open field of grief, what do I do?
Yeah.
And, you know, you mentioned earlier that doing your show, your podcast, Grief is a Sneaky Bitch, that you've learned so much from the people you've had on the show and that you've been using those tools in your own more recent experience of going through cancer. And I wondered if you would share just one of those that's been a go-to for you lately.
Well, one of the biggest, I would say, skills that I've been utilizing in my grief for years, long before cancer came, although I used it for sure in this latest season of my life, is mindfulness. Mindfulness practices, I think, is one of the most profound ways or resources that we can use to ease our suffering and to ease our struggle. Mindfulness being just connecting with the present moment, right? And being without judgment. And also really, I would say compassionate, self-compassion. I think about like Kristen Neff, who was on the show, mindfulness and self-compassion. Because so much of our suffering is the internal, I should feel this way. I shouldn't feel this way. I should want this. I shouldn't want this. I should do this behavior I shouldn't want. And mindfulness is really an invitation to just notice how we're feeling and what we're thinking as is without judgment. And that's what allows us to sort of pierce through the barriers of all of those systems that cause us harm. So for me, that's looked like a whole modality of things. It's probably 8 years now when my feet hit the floor in the morning. I place my feet on the floor, I place my hand over my heart, and I developed a mantra that I said years ago. It really doesn't matter. You can find your own. But I really check in with my breath, with the sensation of my feet on the floor, whether it's cold or hot or sticky or whatever the sensation is. And then I place my hand over my heart. This has been also a really important, simple tool. It's a gesture of care. So much of what we experience in our deep grief, especially in this grief illiterate culture, is a deep feeling of isolation, including our loss of our relationship with ourselves. And so a simple gesture of a hand over your heart is a physiological indicator and reminder that you are cared for. But it also helps you connect with your breath. And we know that our breath, especially when we extend our exhalations, there's lots of tools out there for you all to look up, box breathing and extended exhalations, soothes our nervous system, because so much of what happens for us when we're grieving and when we're feeling denied our grief or we're feeling alone in our grief is we become really activated because grief really is a stress response, right? There's a threat to our lives. So feet on the floor, connecting with the fact that you're here in this moment, connecting with this care of gesture with your hand over your heart, connecting with your breath if you can. And this is what I do, working for a few minutes usually, to extend my exhalations. And then for me, because love felt so impossibly far away for me for so long in my grief, that's what I felt like I really lost track of, not just romantic love, but just sort of love in all its forms. I created this certainty of love meditation, which I read in the audiobook, but which is in the book as well. But a version of that I just say to myself in the morning is, may I see love, may I feel love, may I radiate love, may I receive love. And that mindfulness practice to start my day is one of the many things I do. I lead guided meditations for others in grief. I listen to people's guided meditations on all your favorite apps that you can get. Even some workplaces help employees pay for those apps. But mindfulness is the way to cut through the noise, I think, of that comes at us with all of the ways in which we lose track of our own intuition, because it invites us to set down the judgment that we're doing it wrong, that we're feeling wrong. Yeah. So mindfulness, of all my favorite tools, which there's many, I would say both for myself and everybody that I've served over these years, has been number one. And the beauty of mindfulness is it's a free practice. You don't have to pay for it. And it's available to you wherever you go.
Yeah, it's free, it's portable.
Yeah.
It sounds so simple. It's also one of the hardest things to do. So thanks for telling us the hardest tool, Lisa.
Well, come to me. I will help guide you anytime if you're looking for support. It is hard, I think, but even that, because people say that all the time, I can't quiet my mind and my mind starts wandering. And the whole point of mindfulness practice is I remind folks every time. I invite people from the stage when I'm a keynote speaker. I guide people through a mindfulness practice. That's how important I think it is the goal of mindfulness is not to prevent your mind from wandering. It will 100%. The goal is to cultivate a practice of noticing when it's happened with curiosity and compassion, setting down the thought, coming back to your body, noticing, setting down, coming back, noticing, setting down, coming back. That's what you're getting. That's the muscle you're working at when you're doing a mindfulness practice that you can take out into the world of your day-to-day life. So when you start to get activated, or someone says this stupid shit that people say to you in your grief and you start to feel activated, that's where you can notice that now you're into a story you're telling yourself, that you're going to do 2 years from now or the next time you see that person. And you can notice, set down, come back to your breath, come back to that gesture of care with your hand over your heart. So it's just a practice like everything else, but at least it's a free practice.
It's such an important distinction, that oftentimes people will hear mindfulness and they think mind control.
Yeah.
When it's really about observation.
It's really about observation. And from my narrative therapy training, which is not the same as mindfulness training, it really gives you that same tool of observation. Really around narrative is really about, and which mindfulness does the same, is it's giving yourself enough space between you and your feelings. It's not an invitation to not feel, by the way. This is not like I'm going to think my way out of it, but it gives us enough space to see the emotion and then the feeling, which is really emotion with a story on top of it. That's the distinction between the two. And then to be in relationship with our own experience, whether we want to offer ourselves compassion or whether we want to challenge our thinking. As they say, sometimes we get into stinking thinking. I think of like Ted Lasso, that stinking thinking, right? And mindfulness, as does narrative therapy, invites us to sort of externalize our emotion or the problem we see before us so that we can have some space to be able to navigate it in that way. And again, that's sort of countercultural because we're all about quick and fix and stop feeling and move. And so mindfulness gives us a little spaciousness to sort of be with our grief as it is. Hard thing to do, takes practice. But guess what, folks? Everything worth doing takes practice. Everything you're good at today took practice. And so will mindfulness. But it's worth it, I promise.
Well, Lisa, I can feel that listeners are going to want to spend more time with you, and you're about to go on the road.
Yes.
promoting your book,
Yeah.
Grief is a Sneaky Bitch. And could you just give us a brief little, like, where do people go to find you?
Yeah. Well, you can just check out my website, lisakeefauver.com. It's Lisa, KeeFauver.com. If you sign up for my newsletter, which should be prompted when you show up, the Not So Regular newsletter, you'll get all the updates not so regularly in your inbox. Or you can follow me on socials. I'm always keeping up to date with all of my tour dates and appearances, etc., new podcast episodes at Lisa Keefauver MSW, because I'm a social worker. So you can find me at Lisa Keefauver MSW on Instagram and TikTok and LinkedIn and all the places I try to show up semi-regularly. But I'd love to see people on the road. One of the biggest gifts about writing this book and having it align with the fact that I am finishing cancer treatment, hooray, is that I get to be on the road and be in conversation with fellow authors in every city, but also with folks who've read the book, who've listened to the show for years. I just can't wait to be in community with people. So that's what I'm really looking forward to the most. I'll be in LA and San Francisco and Seattle and Portland with Brennan Wood, and out on the East Coast, New York and Baltimore and Boston, and even in my hometown in Ann Arbor, Michigan later this summer. And but come check me out. And I'm adding cities all the time. So probably lisakeefauver.com/newsletter is your best way to keep up to date on all things tour.
Great. And listeners, Lisa just gently noted that she will be in Portland, which is where Dougy Center is located, at the end of June, June 27th, and in conversation with our executive director, Brennan Wood. So if you live in the Portland area, please come check that out. I'll put all this stuff in the notes for the show. Lisa, thank you so much for your podcast, for your book, for wanting to come on the show, Grief Out Loud, for sharing so many really helpful insights in a really accessible way. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a dream to be on Grief Out Loud. So check that one off my list of dreams come true this year. Thank you so much.
Great. Well, if the dream ever comes back around, we'll have you on for part 2, because I'm sure there's much more that you're going to be doing in the world.
Thank you.
And listeners, you know I say this each and every single time, but thank you for being part of the community, for making the show mean something, for sharing episodes with people who might be helped by or at least interested in what we're talking about here. You can reach out to me directly at griefoutloud@dougy.org. It's dougy.org. That's our main website, where you'll find information about our local programming, all of our free downloadable resources, and of course, each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Excited as always to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.